Okay, welcome back, everybody. I hope your discussion yesterday about model diversity and goals went really well, and that you're all ready for another fun day of modeling today. So yesterday, day one showed us what models are good for, and that we need a lot of different models at different levels of description. So this is one of the last slides I showed you yesterday, and then you guys went into a discussion about what makes a good model and what your goals are and how they might be different from other people's. And what we saw is that there are really a lot of different goals and that they all go with different types of models. And there's a lot of agreement and disagreement about what makes a good model. And that basically every model has different strengths and weaknesses. So the question then, of course, becomes, and what we're going to focus on today, is how in the world do we choose? How do we choose which model is the right one to use under a particular circumstance? And so I wanted to start today by going through some options that are kind of obviously wrong. But bear with me here just to kind of get the conversation going. So the first option that I might pick is that I could choose a type of model or toolkit and try to just apply it all the time, whenever possible. So of course, this means I get really good at this particular type of modeling. But it really seriously limits the types of questions that you can ask. So for example, let's pretend that I absolutely adore optimal control theory. It's the best, it's my favorite, I want to use it all the time. But if all I do is optimal control theory over and over and over again, I might really end up painting myself into a corner. I become a one-trick pony. I'll limit my impact, the progress that I can make in science, and so on. So second option then might be to go with, say, my advisor's favorite toolkit. This, of course, has exactly the same problem. You're going to end up limiting yourself. What if the problem I'm studying really just isn't compatible with optimal control theory? What if I want to study spike trains and information theory? I'm going to have a really hard time fitting that square peg into the round hole. Okay, so here's another option. You might think it's great to use a fashionable toolkit, something that's like super in right now or state of the art, so you can publish in like a really high impact journal. So you might say, hey, you know what's really hot right now, what's really in? Deep convolutional neural nets. Those are the greatest. Artificial intelligence. I'm going to therefore apply state-of-the-art deep convolutional neural nets to this problem, and obviously I will get some insight. Well, okay, but the issue is that randomly applying machine learning, or really any model that's actually fashionable or hot at the moment, this isn't really going to get you very far. A model just fitting the data, that alone doesn't provide a lot of answers. What we are going for here is explanation. And then, of course, on the other side, you could just go with your gut, which model you feel like might be the right one. So the problem with this intuition approach is that, of course, intuition needs to be nurtured. So that's what we're going to start to do in Neuromatch Academy over the next few weeks. We're going to try to nurture that intuition, begin to shape it so you can make good choices about models. So basically what we need to do in general, and what we're going to start doing now in today and then over the next 3 weeks, is to learn to ask really good questions. And this leads us to be able to build and select good models to be able to answer really interesting scientific questions. So remember this process diagram from yesterday? So we're going to get our hands a little dirtier today to see what each of these steps here, these 10 steps, might look like in a real model building exercise. So I'm going to use the same example I gave you yesterday from my own research, but I'm going to walk you through it in a lot more detail to really show you what kind of needed to happen to pick the right model, the right tool for the job. And then today in your tutorials, you're going to do a lot more practicing of that modeling framework to try to start laying the groundwork for building your own models in the future. And I want to preface these next few slides by saying that this is one model from one tiny corner of what might be called computational neuroscience, or in this case, cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience. And so some of the details and the concepts and the background knowledge, this may be unfamiliar to you, just like a couple of the things I talked about yesterday, and that's totally okay. So the point of what we're doing right now is to just walk you through to pay attention to the modeling process, not the details. So we want to go from question all the way at the top through completion, like how to make the publishing story come about. The details are a little bit included if you're interested to learn more, but really the big picture is the important part here. Okay, so the first thing that happens when you begin the modeling process is, of course, identifying the scientific phenomenon that you don't understand yet. So you have to start with this thing that you don't understand. In the case of the set of models that we started looking at yesterday from my own research, the phenomenon in question was this observation that if I apply transcranial magnetic stimulation to primary visual cortex, so the bit of your brain, remember, in the back of your head, there's like that bump on the back of your head right there. If I apply TMS to that spot, if I zap you in the back of the head, in some cases this leads to blindsight-like behavior, where people think they cannot see, but they still can actually use visual information effectively. So you ask them, they say, I can't see at all, but the visual information is still kind of getting in somehow. Okay, so this is what had been previously published, and that TMS to visual cortex also seems to create this same effect. But then there's also this newer group of papers, including the one that I introduced yesterday, that's actually found the opposite, that if I zap you in the back of the head, that TMS to primary visual cortex actually can make you terrible at a visual task, but makes you think that you're doing great. It's like the opposite of blindsight. And so the question that we didn't understand yet was why? Why does this happen, with particular focus on these newer papers that seems to have a lot of traction? Okay, so our next big task is to start to identify the specific questions we can ask with this phenomenon. So this controversy, to try to break down the answer to that why question into kind of bite-sized chunks. So our big question isn't really actually about the controversy per se, but about the newer observation that zapping you in the back of the head makes you terrible at seeing, but feel like you can totally see super well. So why is this the case? So we started to break this down like this by asking specific questions like what computational mechanism inside the visual system could potentially be responsible for this phenomenon? What stage of processing, the encoding stage, the pre-decision stage, the post-decision stage, the motor output, motor preparation and execution stage? Which stage of processing is potentially involved? Here's another potential question. Why would the visual system seemingly fail to optimally kind of read out this visual decision? How come we can make you terrible, but make you feel like you're doing great? So we also need then some specific goals to help us answer these questions. And remember, these goals are kind of like from the model diversity discussion that you guys had last night. So our first goal with this particular project was to fix some previous paradigmatic problems that we saw, some stuff in the behavioral paradigms that had been used that could potentially create biases in the interpretation of the data. So I'm not going to go into details here due to time, but it was possible that these earlier types of behavioral paradigms were biased in a very specific way, that maybe those paradigms were responsible for this apparent dichotomy between it seems like you can zap people and create blind sight, and then also you can zap them and make them have like anti-blind sight or opposing blind sight. Okay, so this goal might be filed under the INSPIRE experiments or the behavioral realism type goals that you guys talked about last night. So the idea here that we want to actually capture and explain the behavior that we see in our human subjects, which is again that zapping you makes you terrible, makes you feel very confident. And then we also wanted to gain some serious kind of basic science insight into the computations that were underlying metacognition, this sense of confidence in humans. So we wanted our model to be interpretable, and we wanted to see whether a normative explanation that's kind of on the information theory side, that this ideal observer model might be able to shed light on the behavior that we saw. Okay, so here's these first three steps in the modeling process. I'm going to start adding numbers here now so you can keep up with the diagram, because it's going to get a little more complicated. So after we've done step one, which is what we just showed previously, our next step is, of course, to go check the literature, to check what's been done before. For inspiration, and to ensure that the modeling system and the modeling approach that we're going to build is really able to incorporate the insights and the knowledge from that previous work. So, as I mentioned before, we already know that previously published papers argue for both the idea that TMS to primary visual cortex can cause blind sight-like behavior in healthy observers under certain conditions. But then we also have the other case that Confidence seems to go up even though accuracy goes down. And then there's some other literature that we also felt that was kind of inspiring. So maybe it's this kind of shortcut that the system has developed that zapping you activates a heuristic in a way that confidence is computed. I'm going to spare you the details, of course, because that's, again, not the point. But basically, there were some other findings. Basically, this is completely outside the realm of TMS and blindsight, but it's actually really useful nonetheless and really relevant. And so another one that we found is that people are really terrible at estimating their own internal noise, that the brain doesn't seem to do a good job at estimating how noisy it is. So brains are variable. They're stochastic. We know that the firing rate isn't regular. It's not exactly the same thing all the time. And so maybe the brain doesn't have a great way of actually estimating its own variability. And so by relying on a shortcut, or a misperception of this internal noise, that might explain the behavior. And then there was also some other work, including some of ours, that suggested that there might be sort of a confirmation bias in perceptual metacognition, which I told you about yesterday. So we took kind of all of these to help inspire our modeling approaches and our mathematically specific hypotheses, which we'll go over in a second. But in addition to all of these kinds of theoretical motivations, we also knew that we needed to come up with a behavioral paradigm to fix that bias that I told you about previously. We thought maybe that might be partially responsible for the controversy, and we wanted our models to be able to be behaviorally realistic as well, to be able to capture that behavior that we saw in the people. So we used all of these findings then to start building a plan, which is basically a set of specific behavioral paradigms and specific questions, and then specific hypotheses to test. So this leads us then to the next step, which is what ingredients do we actually need for our modeling exercise to be successful in answering these questions and achieving kind of those goals that we identified all the way back in step one. And so the first is that we need that bias-free paradigm. So we got that. We used here what's called a 2-interval force-choiced approach for the confidence judgments, which meant that our observers would no longer just be able to say high confidence or no, I didn't see anything. And so the idea here is that we show you a thing and we don't zap you, and you have to discriminate whether this little bar is tilted to the left or to the right or vertical. So that's this question. And then we show you another thing, another little bar, and we say, is it left or right from vertical? But this time we zap you. And then you have to say which target was more visible or which one you think you got right. Okay, so this was our behavioral paradigm that we came up with. Again, details are not important. This is just to orient you to kind of the approach. And then, of course, we need some human observers to actually do the task. And then we'll get some behavioral data out of the project. And to do this, we're also going to need TMS equipment and expertise to be able to actually approach the behavioral paradigm appropriately. Okay, so those are our ingredients. Next, we need to do hypotheses. We've got our problem, our questions, and our goals, our inspiration from the literature. And so now we got to put all this together, and we need to make our hypotheses really specific so that we can go and test them with our models. So here's now where the models that I introduced to you yesterday, very briefly, they come back into the picture. So we thought that maybe there were two kind of candidates, conceptual approaches for how these metacognitive computations were performed by the visual system. So these hypotheses, again, very briefly from yesterday, is that, I show you a stimulus and then I allow the system, using some fancy math, to estimate its own noise, to be able to kind of calculate its own variability. And then it goes on to make those orientation discrimination decisions, like is the bar tilted left or right from vertical, and then the confidence judgments here. And then either we allow the model to estimate its own noise to be able to get a sense of its own variability, or we make it guess. We make it use that shortcut or heuristic, a misperception of variance. So this is the primary, really the only difference between these two models. And we can use some fancy math to fill in kind of what's going on in these arrows. Some math here and some math here. Okay. Oh, yeah. And so these are the icons that I'm going to use to specify these two models going forward. I briefly introduced these yesterday as well. But the shortcut here is, again, that the metacognitively aware model can estimate its own noise, which we describe with fancy math. The metacognitively blind model cannot. And by the way, neither of these are actually blind sight. This would be kind of the opposite of blind sight, but that's because, again, in our behavior and in the previous studies, we saw this kind of behavior and sometimes this kind of behavior, but never the opposite. Okay, and so then now we're in a position to specify the expected decisions and confidence judgments from both of these models mathematically. I'm skipping the details. Again, they are not important, but now we can build these into mathematical hypotheses and then evaluate how well the models are actually doing. So this is all steps 1 through 3, 4 inside the framing the question box in our modeling framework. And now we get to go into the next steps, which are selecting the modeling toolkit and drafting and implementing the model. So we've got our hypotheses, our behavioral paradigm, ingredients, everything, right? We've specified what's going to happen, and we've done so super precisely with some math. So now we can quantitatively assess how our models are doing. So now comes the big part, the big decision. We need a tool that will link what we have in the problem space, which is this first part here, to the desired output. What we observed was this weird phenomenon that decreased performance and increased confidence can occur. But we also have some other elements to consider. So we saw that the behavior is stochastic, it's probabilistic, it's noisy, there's something having to do with variability from one trial to the next. So we need to take that into account when we evaluate which toolkit is appropriate. So here are the goals that we described previously. Just put them up there and have you remember what they are. So we want to capture that behavior that is stochastic, that is noisy, and we want to gain some insights into those metacognitive computations. So here's some of the toolkits that you're going to learn about over the next couple weeks. And we want to see how well these tools are going to be able to evaluate or capture and address these very specific goals. So keeping in mind these goals, let's pick a couple from the next few weeks and see how they might actually work. So the first one that we thought maybe, potentially we could use would be, let's check out linear systems. Okay, so linear systems, well, they're not really about probability. So they don't really explicitly include noise. And we saw that the behavior was stochastic, it was variable, it was noisy. So that really can't be a good toolkit to use to answer these questions. Here's another one that I mentioned previously. So what about optimal control theory? That seems like maybe it could be a candidate. Well, this is also not really about controlling anything, right? It's about how the brain is perceiving stuff. So this probably cannot be right either. Maybe reinforcement learning. That's pretty in right now, pretty popular. But there's no learning here. This is just here's a bar and discriminate the orientation at the bar and then rate your confidence. That's basically all we're doing. So there's no learning. And so a reinforcement learning approach is probably not appropriate either. How about a biophysical model, a biophysically plausible model, like a leaky integrated fire or something like that? So this could potentially work. There's some noise there. There's some stochasticity. But keeping in mind our goals, which are maybe we want something interpretive or interpretable, we want something normative, we want it to be behaviorally realistic all the way up at the level of behavior, not at the level of neurons. So maybe biophysical plausibility is a little too much detail. Maybe we can get away with not specifying neurons and their connections, and we can just use something that's a little bit more zoomed out. Okay, how about machine learning? Hey, we can solve everything with machine learning, right? Okay, well, not really, and it's not really appropriate here because here we just really want to do an inference about this simple stochastic behavior. Here's a line, is it left or right? Rate your confidence, that's it. And again, we also want to be able to interpret what we find. And so as you guys are going to learn over the next couple weeks, in machine learning, the interpretation is actually sometimes really difficult because the models can be very opaque. They're essentially black boxes. You can't go peeking inside. You can't open them up and really understand how they solved the problem. Okay, so how about this one? Bayesian ideal observers or normative models. So now we're talking. A normative statistical model, this would potentially be a really great fit for building and evaluating that metacognitively aware and with a couple tweaks, that metacognitively blind model. We can build statistical models that have flavors of this Bayesian decision or ideal observer theory. And then we can keep that same kind of toolkit, that framework. So this is the one that we choose, the Bayesian ideal observer or the stochastic statistical models. And the details, again, are not important. I'm actually not even going to go over what the math looks like Because the point here is you're going to learn the relevant detail over the next couple weeks, and today we're just talking about the big picture. So this is the toolkit that we chose because it fit our goals much better than all of the other options. We ended up implementing this with some Monte Carlo simulations in MATLAB, and we fitted it to the behavior of the observers, the human observers in the experiment. There are a lot of other ways we could have implemented it, but that's the one that we ended up choosing. Okay, so now that we've chosen our modeling toolkit, here are the results. We need to evaluate how well the models are doing. So first we fit the metacognitively aware, that normative ideal observer model. And we see here, model is black, data is red. The model and the data are not overlapping at all when we plot perceptual performance versus confidence. This is terrible. This is the terrible fit. The metacognitively aware model has absolutely no idea what the people are doing, basically. So the metacognitively aware normative ideal observer model is terrible. The metacognitively blind model is actually doing a whole lot better. It's not perfect. The behavior is kind of noisy. This red line is a little squiggly, but it's a heck of a lot better than the metacognitively aware model. And so in this competition here, the metacognitively blind model wins. It was the best fitting model of the ones that we tried. We did also try a couple other variants just to make sure that we're not missing anything. And so then we ended up publishing this work in the journal Cortex about 3 years ago now. And so if you want to know any more details about the model and so on, you can go and have a look at the paper. But again, the point is not the paper. It's not the details of the model. The point is to walk through this whole process, starting from a thing that you don't understand through to picking the modeling toolkit and evaluating the results. There's a lot of steps in here that we need to go through. And so this is what we're going to focus on today, from the beginning all the way to the finish line. Okay, so with this project, we were able to publish like that one set of models. But that's, again, definitely not the only thing that we could have done with that question. So the two models that I showed you, the metacognitively blind and the aware models, they would probably kind of land over here on the Y side of this graph. So we have what, how, why here, and the ones that we just built are really more in the Y space, and they're kind of up here at the level of people and central nervous system and system. Kinds of levels of analysis. But there are a lot of other models that we could have built or tested to try to explain this phenomenon. In fact, by using that particular bias-free paradigm that I briefly told you about, we also had a bit of explanation over here, a descriptive behavioral kind of approach, like what is the behavior of the system under this new bias-free kind of paradigm. So that would be more in the what category of the models, also up here at the kind of people level approach. But we could have done all sorts of other stuff. So all of those toolkits that I mentioned, well, many of those toolkits that I mentioned a couple slides ago, they potentially could have also been built to answer some of the questions about this system. So it's not that all of those other toolkits are bad necessarily. It's just that they were not right for the types of questions that we wanted to ask. They're just different. They're not aligned with the goals that we had for the project. So we could have tried to understand what TMS does to the system by building an integrated biophysically plausible model, as I said. There were a lot of other choices that we could have made. So this was just the one that we made in order to be able to address the goals that we actually had. Okay, so that's the whole roadmap start to finish, from identifying the phenomenon you don't understand all the way through publication, and then of course the cycle starts again. And so today in your tutorials, you're going to start discovering all of these steps together with some little toy examples, and we hope that you're going to ask a lot of questions along the way. This is really an active learning approach, so we really hope that you're going to get involved and discuss with your groups to be able to get the most out of today's exercises. So I just want to take a couple minutes then to introduce today's tutorial so that you know what to expect. So we're going to start here by specifying the problem space. So this is really this top box here, steps 1 through 4, where you're framing the question. You're going to do this actually today using a cute little toy example, which is the idea of the train illusion, or the illusory self-motion that you feel on a train sometimes. So you've probably all experienced this on a train or maybe an airplane at some point in your life. So you're sitting there on the train, you're sitting in the station, you're not moving, you're just looking out the window. and then the train next to you starts moving. And what happens is you feel like you're actually moving in the opposite direction, even though your train is still very clearly sitting in the same spot. Maybe the doors are even still open. So it feels like you're moving, but you're absolutely not moving. And so basically what's happening is your brain has to decide, like, is the world moving or am I moving? Which one of these is the most reasonable explanation for the visual data that it's getting? And your brain is deciding between these two possible scenarios, and it makes the wrong choice. And the result is that you end up feeling phenomenologically like you are actually the one moving. So this is our cute example that we walk through in today's tutorials. And so we're going to start then with the phenomenon, which describes this experimental observation that we don't understand, which is the illusory self-motion on the train. And so what you're going to see today is that this description is going to include really detailed, rich data, ideally. When does this happen? How strong is the illusion? That kind of thing. And so then the next step is to specify the questions. So this lack of understanding is going to trigger these specific types of research questions. What is going on? Why is going on? Why is it going on? How is this happening? So for the train example, we might be interested in maybe which parameters correlate with the illusion strength. So that would be like a descriptive level question. But we might also want to know why or how the illusion occurs, what the causal or neuronal level questions might be going on there. Okay, so now let's pick the what question just here, just for the sake of argument. And so now that you've got your questions, what is going on, then you can start to formulate specific hypotheses about the expected relationships or mechanisms or properties underlying the train illusion. So remember that your hypotheses are going to critically depend on your question. So in this correlational kind of descriptive question, we could hypothesize about whether speed or window aperture or weather conditions might actually explain or might actually relate to the phenomenon's strength. And then we could also specify maybe the relationship between these variables and the phenomenon in question. So is it a linear relationship? Is it a quadratic relationship? That sort of thing. And then, of course, don't forget about your goals, right? As we discussed earlier, the goals are really important, and that the goals really are going to depend on the hypotheses and circle back around. So the goals drive the hypotheses and vice versa. And so, for example, if we consider like the window aperture, how big the window is, maybe that's our crucial parameter of interest. That means that we might have an engineering goal of optimizing train window design. Maybe that's our goal in life. We might also have a basic science goal of like characterizing how the visual system works. We might have a clinical goal of reducing how nauseous you feel when you experience the illusion. So there are a lot of different goals that we might have that would also drive our modeling choices. Okay, so after the model is fully specified, after the problem space is fully specified, then in the later tutorials of today, we're going to move on to discussing how we would implement the model, test the model, and then eventually make a narrative story and publish the model. So what this means is that today's plan is really going to walk you through this whole process with that cute little toy example of the motion illusion. And you're going to have a lot of iterative brainstorming and coding, brainstorm code, that kind of thing. And so here are the micro tutorials that you're going to go through today to home in on those questions and goals. So first, you're going to imagine whether or how you would do an experiment to play with this kind of phenomenon. You're going to gather some background information. You're going to specify your ingredients. You're going to specify your hypotheses. Then you're going to pick a modeling toolkit that's totally right for the questions that you want to answer. Just spoiler alert, it's not going to be deep learning. And then you get to keep going. So we're going to getting into diagramming the model and implementing the model, completing it, finishing it up, polishing it up, and then evaluating it to see how well it actually does in describing the phenomenon in question. And then, of course, you want to make a story. You want to make your findings into a nice narrative so you can end up getting it published. So today is really strongly theoretical, but remember, the best way to pick the best model for the job is to start to develop that intuition to learn to ask great questions so you can really build good, informative, and powerful models. So the important part of today is to really pay attention to and think about these 10 steps, the process, the logic of the process that you're going through. And the code that you guys are going to have access to today and that you're going to play with today, that's really just there to show you how things play out in this little simple toy project. So I'm sure you guys are going to have lots of questions along the way. The tutorials will help you ask or answer them. But we hope that you're also going to really discuss a lot with your groups. Lots of discussion, lots of back and forth. That's the best way to do this. So do that in small groups and in your whole pod, all of you with your TA together. Okay, and so most importantly, have a great time today. Cheers.